Hey everyone, welcome back to Endless Money Pits. This is my 2000 BMW 328i, and today I'm going to show you how to rebuild the brake calipers. I actually installed remanufactured brake calipers just a few years ago, and they're already seizing up worse than the original ones ever did. If you want something done right, you've got to do it yourself. Most brake calipers function the same way, so this process could be applied to a lot of other vehicles. I'm rebuilding my brakes today because all four of them are rubbing, and one in particular is getting very hot. Here I am checking the brake temperatures after a very short drive.
Why is it nothing like that?
Because it's hot. 835 degrees.
800?
Yeah. Here are the tools that I used for this job. 17mm socket, 16mm S-wrench, 16mm ratcheting wrench, 14mm flare wrench, 9mm box wrench, regular flathead screwdriver, tiny flathead screwdriver, angled pick, coarse steel wool, plastic mallet, torque wrench, impact wrench, a jack and jack stands, rubber gloves, safety glasses, and a fluid drain pan. For this job I also needed brake cleaner, clear rubber hose with 1/4-inch diameter, disc brake caliper lubricant, 1 bottle of DOT4 brake fluid, new seals for all 4 brake calipers, and a helper to pump the brake pedal. If you're rebuilding all 4 brakes, you'll also have to bleed all 4 brakes. That means you should do them in this order, starting with the wheel furthest from the brake fluid reservoir and working your way closer. This will ensure that you don't contaminate the new brake fluid with the old brake fluid. To start this job, I'll jack up the rear of the car and put it on jack stands. You'll need to break the lug nuts free first if you aren't using an impact wrench like mine. If your jack doesn't fit at first, just keep forcing it. An impact wrench is not necessary, but I already bought one, so I try to use it as much as I can. With the wheel off, pull the brake wear sensor and tuck it somewhere out of the way. Removing this anti-rattle clip is a little tricky. You'll need to flex it the right way to pull it out. These 2 plastic dust caps can be removed now or at the bench. If they are missing, you will want to replace them. Check for links in the description. There's not enough space here for a breaker bar, so I used a plastic mallet with a 16mm S-wrench to break free the 2 bolts holding the caliper to the car. A regular box wrench would be fine. Don't forget to loosen the brake line before removing the caliper from the disc. Use a flare wrench when working on brake lines to make sure you don't strip the fittings. The brake pads can also be removed now or at the bench. They should pop out pretty easily, but I needed to pry out the inner pad. Have your helper pump the brakes until the piston comes free from the caliper. Okay, yeah, pump it, but go slow. Yeah, I'll tell you when to stop. Okay, stop. Stop pumping when the piston moves freely by hand. Now we can unscrew the caliper from the brake line and take it over to the bench. Tuck the brake line out of the way pointed up so it doesn't leak all its fluid and fill with air. Brake fluid will pour from the caliper once you remove the piston, so be ready to catch it. With the fluid drained, you can pry off the outer rubber seal. This piston has some serious pitting, but since it's mainly on the exposed side of the rubber seal, this won't impair the brake's functionality. Probably. Just to be safe, I'm going to clean up the piston as well as I can with some coarse steel wool. It's not perfect, but that actually worked out pretty well. I tried using a Dremel with a very soft pad to clean up the inside of this groove, but it didn't really work and doesn't seem necessary. Next, slide out the carrier. This will make it easier to remove the inner piston seal and clean everything. I used an angle pick to get the seal out, but you could use a small flathead screwdriver. I used a tiny flathead screwdriver wrapped in a rag to wipe out any debris from this groove. With the caliper disassembled, I sprayed it with brake cleaner to remove any residual dirt and grime. Brake cleaner evaporates pretty fast. Once dry, you can install the rubber seals. Prep the inner seal with a light layer of caliper grease for a good seal. It should easily pop down into the gap and stay there. Once in place, make sure there is a light layer of grease on the inner diameter of the seal too. Next, you'll need to lube the piston and slide the outer seal onto the end. Note the orientation of the seal. It should fit pretty snugly on the piston and might be a little difficult to get on because it's so slippery. Getting the seal seated is a little tricky. Here's what worked for me. Put the seal on the very end of the piston and insert the rear edge of the seal into the caliper first. Then use the tiny screwdriver to push the rest of the seal into place while making sure it doesn't slide off of the piston. With the lower part of the seal seated in the caliper groove and the upper part still fully on the piston, you can push the piston all the way down into the caliper. Go slow and make sure everything is seated properly. It shouldn't take much force to push it down. The piston should sit flush with the outer seal. The slides on this carrier are pretty dirty, so I used the steel wool to clean them up too. Once they're nice and clean, apply a thin layer of caliper grease onto the slides and reinstall the carrier into the caliper. Now the pads can be installed like this. Installing the anti-rattle clip takes a bit of pressure and patience. The outer fingers will have tension on them when installed, and the inner fingers have hooks to hold the clip in place. Back at the car, it's time to reinstall the caliper. First, reattach the caliper to the brake line. Make sure it's snug. Then, mount the caliper and install the 2 bolts that hold it in place. There's no room for a torque wrench here, so just make sure these bolts are on tight. The next step is to bleed the brake fluid to get any air bubbles out of the line. Do not skip this step. Open the brake fluid reservoir and make sure the fluid is topped off. Back at the brake caliper, remove the dust cap. Put a 9mm box wrench on the bleed screw. Then put your hose over the nipple with the other end in a container to catch the brake fluid.
You ready?
Now we're ready to bleed the line using these steps. Build pressure by having your helper pump the brake pedal.
Do it till it gets hard. Let me know when you're done.
Open the bleed screw. Close the bleed screw quickly. Release the brake pedal and repeat.
Okay, do it again. Okay, do it again.
Go back to the reservoir every 5 cycles or so and make sure the fluid is topped off so you don't suck any air into the lines from there. Keep bleeding the line until clean fluid starts coming out.
Okay.
When you're done, remove the hose and wrench from the bleed screw. Close the dust cap and reattach the brake pad wear sensor. That's it for bleeding the brake caliper. Now we can put the wheel back on. If you had trouble getting your wheel off, it might be a good idea to put some grease or anti-seize on the surfaces where the wheel contacts the rotor. Tighten the lug nuts by hand as much as possible before lowering the car back onto the ground. They should be tightened in a crisscross pattern and torqued to about 88 foot-pounds. Now just do all this 3 more times and we're done. That concludes this week's video. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this, and until next time, just keep throwing money at it. Please recycle your used automotive fluids!
Oh, not money. Is it money?
Try not to make a lot of loud noises. I gotta edit those out. And that's the fast, easy way to rebuild a brake caliper.